Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Paramita and I heartily welcome you to my channel Paramita PM. If you are new to my channel, then I would request you to go through the content of my channel, look at the videos, and if you really find those videos helpful and if they really heighten your interest, then do like it, share it, and do not forget to subscribe to my channel. And most importantly, please turn on the notification bell button so that you get notified whenever I upload any new videos on my channel. So now, without any further ado, let's get into the lecture. In this audio lecture, we shall discuss the importance of chapter 3 of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Here in this very chapter, we find that the narrator is a bit disappointed because she has not been able to come up with some authentic fact with regard to the statement as to why women are poorer than men, and therefore she decides to investigate women who belong to the Elizabethan England. And then she feels that it is better to ask the historian who is not to record opinions but truths, and then she would be able to understand under what conditions women lived during the Elizabethan period, because we all know that Elizabethan period was a very productive literary period, but then the narrator finds that women had, very few rights in that era. After she goes through a history book, and in spite of having strong personalities, especially the ways of art, because we find that women in fiction were held in high esteem, and this makes us see the difference between fiction and reality. While in reality, the woman in fiction, as I said, she was held in high esteem, but when it comes to reality, she was locked up and she was, treated no less than a slave. Her status was no more than a slave. So women were seen to have importance only in fiction. Otherwise, they were considered to be completely, insignificant. Practically, but imaginatively, she had enough importance. So, and the narrator believes that there is a deep connection between creativity and living conditions. And after reading the history book by Trevelyan's History of England, after she got the book, she finds that women did not have the right to choose their, life partner, even they were married at an early age, much against their wish. So now the question, the perennial puzzle, or the perennial, question that has been there as to why women did not write a word of that extraordinary literature, emerges in the mind of the narrator as to why women did not write fiction. And then she also feels that, as I said, that creativity has a very deep connection with living conditions. And when she reads Trevelyan's History of England, she finds that there is hardly any mention of, middle-class women, and merged in her mind remain unanswered. And it was during this period, during the Elizabethan period, women's status was such that their husband, that once they got married, the husband was given the position of the master, was given the position of a lord, who used to simply, dominate. And even marriage took place when they were hardly out of their nurse's church, which means that a very, very young used to get married. And these marriages, were not the results of personal affection. Rather, these marriages were simply imposed upon women during this period. And here she begins to talk about, Shakespeare's women characters, the ones that he had portrayed in his works. And then the narrator says that now if we begin to consider, or if we start having a look at these famous women characters of Shakespeare, like Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, or Rosalind. Okay, it would seem that these women, the way they were portrayed in these fictional works, they had their own will, they were determined, and they had much freedom. But when it comes to reality, we get to see a completely different picture. The truth is completely different. This is how women were portrayed during the Elizabethan period in the fictional works. They were portrayed as attractive, they were portrayed as, a very determined, very willful, who were able to speak their truth, who were courageous, brave. But when we look at the status of women in practical life, we see a huge gap between these two representations. This is women in fiction. But in fact, as historian Professor Trevelyan points out, were marginalized, women were beaten, they were dominated, and they were locked up. So we can see that women had importance only in fiction, while in reality she was no more than a slave. This is her status when it comes to practical life. While in fiction we find these women, speaking words of inspiration, motivation, and they seem to have profound thoughts which fall from their lips. But in real life, she remained uneducated, she remained illiterate. She couldn't speak, she couldn't read, she couldn't spell, and she was simply treated as the property of her husband. It was certainly an odd monster that one made up by reading the historians first and the poets afterwards. So when we look at the account given by the historian, and then when we look at the depiction of women by the famous writers, we find that it gives rise to a very strange creature whose representation is completely different in fictional works and which completely departs from reality. So the narrator feels that what can be done in order to bring this creature to life, in order to bring this woman to life. She says that one has to acknowledge both fact and fiction. It's not that in reality, in practical life, we will treat women badly, inhumanly, and in fiction, they will be held in high esteem. No. One has to keep in touch with fact. One has to acknowledge fact and fiction at the same time. But then she also acknowledges the truth that it is not possible. Whenever one tries to acknowledge fact and fiction, because when we look at history, we find that there is hardly any mention of her. So we have to, the narrator comes to the conclusion that when one tries to acknowledge fact and fiction at the same time, especially when they try to do that with the Elizabethan woman, it fails. Because there is hardly any fact, there is hardly any truth available about the Elizabethan woman. Because history scarcely mentions her. So when one takes the initiative to acknowledge both fact and fiction, it fails due to the lack of historical account related to the Elizabethan woman. And the narrator, after going through the history book, William's History of England, she finds that middle-class women were completely discarded because they did not have much role to play, so they were hardly mentioned in history. So now what we actually need is information, huge mass of information that is needed, because this is what is lacking. We do not have sufficient information about the average Elizabethan woman. So here we find through the narrator, Woolf seems to bestow a responsibility upon the students of Gatton and Newnham, that they could maybe this information is all scattered about somewhere, so one could collect it and make a book of it, and they should take an attempt to rewrite history, where women might also figure, where women might appear there without any kind of indecency. Because when it comes to women, we always get a relation to the lives of great men. They do not have any important, significant role to play as such. They come to the forefront only in connection to the lives of great men. And when the narrator, once again she serves the bookshelves, and she finds that nothing is actually known about women. There is hardly any information available about women before the 18th century. So there was hardly any information was at hand. And she did not even have any model or any example, any instance in her mind to which she would turn. And then she begins to question why women did not write poetry in the Elizabethan age. The several questions which emerge in the mind of the narrator with regard to the position or the condition of the Elizabethan women. So she says that I do not have enough information, so I do not know why Elizabethan women did not write poetry, why I did not know, even I am not sure whether they were educated or not, whether they were taught to write, even whether they had private rooms of their own. How many children did they have? Nothing. But according to Professor, it became clear, it is evident to the narrator that they did not have money and they were married, whether they liked it or not, at the age of 15 or 16. So at a very, very young age, they used to get married. So now in this very situation, in this very condition, it would be really strange if any women of that time would have written plays of Shakespeare. It would really appear to be very, very strange, because we can see that we hardly have any information about them. And here the narrator recalls that she agrees. He recalls a bishop's statement that who said that an old gentleman, the bishop, who said that it was impossible for any woman to have the genius of Shakespeare. So now the narrator believes that such a female genius, she remembers, after remembering the bishop's statement, that no woman could ever equal the genius of Shakespeare. And then now immediately the narrator's thoughts turn to Shakespeare. And then here we come across this statement where it is written, where Woolf writes, women cannot write the plays of Shakespeare. Now here the myth of Shakespeare's sister Judith appears. And the narrator begins to imagine what would have happened if Shakespeare's sister named Judith. As far as Shakespeare is concerned, here we are provided with a little account about Shakespeare's life. He was free, he went to school, grammar school, where he learned logic, where he learned Latin, Horace, and the elements of grammar and logic. And he was a very wild boy, and he got married at a very young age when he was not supposed to, and not only that, he also gave birth to a child much earlier than he was supposed to do. And then he left his wife after bearing a child, and then he went to London to seek his fortune. So here we are provided with Shakespeare's exposure to the outside world. He worked at theatre in London, where he acted himself, where he met theatre people, and so on, while his sister Judith was not able to attend school. Not only that, whenever she tried to read something on her own, she was completely discouraged by her parents. Not only that, she was married against her will as a teenager. But she had a taste for theatre, just like her brother. And it was this force of her own gift, let's say, or her inclination, and she ran away to London. So we can see the difference in treatment between Shakespeare and Judith, his sister. Shakespeare was allowed to educate himself. He got exposed to the outer world. He got married to the outer world. He got married at his own will. And then he went to London to pursue his career. While Judith, Shakespeare's sister, who was equally talented and gifted like him, she was equally imaginative, adventurous, to see the outside world. She was made to remain at home. She was never sent to school. And for her, her domestic life became an obstacle. Because as I said, whenever, she tried to read something on her own, she tried to study anything on her own, immediately she was made to do household work by her family. So domesticity became a huge obstacle for Judith. So after she left home, she was not even 17 years old. And here we come to know, a few similarities that she had with Shakespeare. She had the quickest fancy, which means she was imaginative as well. And she had a taste for the theatre like Shakespeare. But after she left home, she was denied her chance to work at the theatre in London. And she was not even allowed to learn the craft. She got impregnated by a theatrical man, and which led her to commit suicide. So one winter night, Judith kills herself. So this was Judith's outcome when she attempted to pursue her interests and dreams like Shakespeare. This became Judith's lot when she tried to be a part of the outer world. She was not at all helped by anyone. Rather, it led to her